All right, so anyways, if I could not be interrupted for the 5th time in the message. No, joke. He says, as I passed by Macedonia and Greece on my way to Jerusalem, I also would like to at some point stop by and see you as well. And the reason he tells them I'm passing by Macedonia and Greece is because they have given this money towards Jerusalem. So this is where we actually learn that Corinth finally, that's what Greece is in the passage, and Achaia. This is where we finally learn that Corinth actually did come up with the money. This is one of the places we can learn that. So they did finally give what they were supposed to, but it took a lot of fighting. Like part of 1 Corinthians is devoted to arguing with them about this. Most of 2 Corinthians, or at least a third of it, I would say, is devoted to fighting with them about this, to the point where Paul was being called a reprobate and all these things by people who said he's just after their money. And so Paul took this very serious, that you made a promise to God, now you better keep it. You made a promise to God, and other people also got excited and joined you, and now you're going to make me and you both ashamed, is what we saw in the morning passage, if you don't keep it. So we see now he's finally collecting it. He's going to take it, he's going to go to Jerusalem, and he's mentioning this to the church at Rome. And while the question is one you'll have to look way beyond this passage to get an answer to, as to whether or not they were ever responsible in the first place to give money to help other people have a church, because that's what missions money is for. It's helping other people have a church. Now, we'll talk about this next month, like the difference between evangelism, church planting, and all that kind of stuff. We'll get into that in the coming month. But you understand, when we give money for missions, the idea is I'm giving money so that somebody can either go start a church, or somebody who started a church can help keep that church running, or something of that nature. But the purpose of the liberality offering, of giving money to missions like this, is so that somebody other than you can also have a church. Your tithes are so you can have a church. Your offering of liberality, this faith promise giving, whatever you want to call it, is so that other people somewhere else can have a church. Whether that be through missions, or whether it be, in this case, they're supporting an existing church. And so their obligation to this church has to be seen in that light. That their obligation is not that they're trying to start a church in Jerusalem, is that they want to keep a church in Jerusalem going. And so that's the thing, is there's some missionaries that we want to help them keep their ministry going because it's not able to support itself. And there's some missionaries we want to get them there and get a church started, like what we have with Brother D'Amelio and Dr. Seabury. One who's established and we want to keep him going, and one who is just getting started and we want to be part of that. But either way, we're trying to make sure people, in one case in Kenya and other parts of Africa, have churches, and in the other case, we want to make sure one very specific city in Italy has a church. But regardless, we're doing our part to make sure that gets done. But the question is, are we obligated to do it? And in regards to the liberality offering, I have to start by saying that their primary obligation throughout the passage is not that God had said you have to give money to support the church in Jerusalem. It's that you promised it and now you have to keep your promise. That God expects them to keep the promises they make. So that's not what I'm talking about, because you've not made a promise to give anything to missions other than the 2 that we said we'd give money from the church for. So that's not a obligation that falls on you individually. That's an obligation for us as a church to take money out of the income of the church, as we said we would, and do that. So that obligation doesn't answer your question. And that's not the obligation that he mentions in this passage. That's why this passage is so special compared to the others that deal with the liberality offering, is because every other time he's talking to Corinth, and when he's explaining it to Corinth, the emphasis is, you promised it, you have to keep your promises. But this time he's talking to Rome about Corinth, and he gives us a different perspective of whether or not they should have made this promise in the first place. And the interesting thing is, every time he talks to Corinth, he emphasizes that it's your choice. You have a free will. You chose to give this offering. You put yourself in this situation. But when he talks to Rome about it, he says it's normal that they should have paid this, that it's something that they're indebted to do. They owe it to Jerusalem to do this. And that's where it becomes a very interesting question, is, are we indebted? Do we owe anything to making sure that there's churches being planted or established or maintained or those kind of things in other parts of the world? Or are we comfortable to just say, well, we believe in a local church and therefore we can just give money to our church and we've done our part? And there's some things you have to understand to answer that question. And honestly, you would think I would start with the Great Commission, but I'm not going to start with the Great Commission. I'm going to start with something else, something that the language of this passage points us to. And then we can go talk about some of those more general things. But you notice what he says here, if you'll look with me at verse number 27. It says, "It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are, for if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things." That should sound very familiar to you, because it's almost the exact same language he used in 1 Corinthians 9 when he was explaining to the church at Corinth that every church has an obligation or responsibility to take care of their pastor. And I'll go to 1 Corinthians 9. Even though we have talked about it a little bit this month, I will go there because I want you to see it here. I want to make sure you have it today and not that you're remembering something we talked about 5 weeks ago. So 1 Corinthians chapter number 9, you notice he talks about this idea that if you have taken spiritual profit from somebody, then there is a carnal cost to that. And if you know what he means, based off of what he says in 1 Corinthians 9, then you know he's talking about money. He's talking about financially supporting those who feed you spiritually. Those who you have profited from spiritually, that you pay them just like you would pay somebody who does any other kind of service for you. And you see that, again, it should be clear in the passage we just read, but it becomes abundantly clear here in 1 Corinthians 9, we'll start in verse 1. We'll read most of the chapter, honestly. It says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. Mine answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat and to drink?" Now, let me give you context why Paul's saying this and why maybe it sounds a little bit aggressive. Paul's saying to them, am I not an apostle? Like, do you not know that he's an apostle? He was an eyewitness, and this is where people get being an eyewitness of the resurrected Christ as a requirement for being an apostle. It's from this statement. He follows it, but it's not the only thing he follows it with. You'd have to make all of this a requirement to be an apostle if you interpret it that way. But he follows it with, didn't I see Jesus Christ with my own eyes? And he gives this list of things here saying, like, don't you see that I'm doing God's work, that God called me into this? Jesus Christ spoke to me himself on the road to Damascus, and I saw him with my own eyes. I didn't just make this up and come start preaching to you my opinions. And so the reason why he's saying all of that to them, and he says, like, if anybody else can say I'm not an apostle and doubt me, that's fine, but you can't say that. Because the only reason any of you got saved is because I came to Corinth and preached the gospel to you. It's not like other churches where somebody who got scattered from Jerusalem come there and started a church. You were all lost before I got there and gave you the gospel. The first fruits of your church are people that I led to Christ, and that's why your church is one of the few churches where I actually baptize people as well, because of the fact that nobody there was saved. I had to baptize people and get the church started. So you understand, like, this is the point he's making to them, is that when it comes to their church, they have no reason to doubt Paul. That when he's talking to them about money, they have no reason to call him greedy or any of this. And so that's the context. Some people in the church have begun to say Paul only cares about money because of this whole liberality offering thing, and have begun to attack him and say that he's greedy, he's a reprobate, he's all this kind of stuff. He's just in it for the money. And Paul is saying, you can't say that. Like, maybe another church could say that about me. But the point he makes to Corinth is you can't say that, because the only reason your church exists is because of me. The only reason you're saved is because of me. You can't say that. If anybody's proof that I'm not a liar, I'm not a thief, I'm not a false apostle, it's you. So it was crazy that Corinth would attack him that way is the point he's making. So that's why I say if it sounds aggressive, that's why. So when he says, have we not power to eat, to drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister as a wife as well as others, as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? What he's saying there is, don't I have power? Don't I have the right to eat and drink? Don't I have the right to have food? Don't I have the right to have the basic needs of this life? And he says, don't I have the right? If I wanted to get married, I could do that if I wanted to. He says, Peter's married, so why can't I get married? James and Joseph and the brothers of Jesus, they're all married. So it's not that I'm a preacher that is why Paul didn't get married. It's not because the Pope put it on him and said he wasn't allowed to get married, or if he got married, he would take his wife and kids and sell them into slavery to finance the Catholic Church. That's not why Paul didn't get married. That hadn't happened yet. Paul didn't get married because at some point in his life, we can learn from the Bible, he was married, and most likely his wife died. There is some indication you could argue that she left him, but most likely she died is what we can learn from certain things that he says, like this, when he says, I have the right to marry. So he's making the point that, like, if you looked at the law, he had the right to marry, which means, in theory, his wife is probably dead. There are some other arguments could be made, but in theory, his wife is dead. And so him and Barnabas, him and Silas, they didn't marry because of the fact that they decided to dedicate themselves entirely to the ministry that was in front of them, and knew that it would be hard to take care of a wife and kids if you're running around starting churches every so many months in a new city, whereas Peter was staying at one church, being the pastor of that church, and it was a lot easier for Peter to just settle down. Well, he was already married before Jesus came to him, but it was a lot easier for him to just stay there with his wife and kids and take care of them. So you understand that's the point he's making. Like, all these other guys have families. All these other guys' churches support them and pay money for them to have food to eat and the basic needs of life. Why do you think Paul and Barnabas don't have that? Do you think that there's something, like, they don't deserve it? What's the question? What's the issue here? He says, or only I and Barnabas have we not power to forbear working? And this is where he's saying, is it only me and Barnabas that are not allowed to give up our secular jobs and make ministry our job? It's like everybody else. Peter's not a fisherman anymore. James didn't pick up the carpentry business when Jesus died on the cross. Is it only me and Barnabas that don't have to go and work a secular job? We can make ministry our full-time job? Because Paul was working as a tent maker some. But again, I'll answer your questions about that soon as to why he was doing that. And then here's his argument. He says, who goeth a warfare at any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of this hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, it is a great thing. Is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? And that's where you see this verse and Romans tied together. His point he's making is he says, I'm saying to you logically, like, you can understand this to where it makes sense, that anybody can understand that, it's not unreasonable that me and the other men who are the shepherds should eat from the flock. We should, if we're going to do the work of the shepherd, we should have the rewards of the shepherd. If we're going to do the work of the farmer, we should have the rewards of the farmer. And if our work is the gospel, we should have the rewards of that work. It's normal. Every job does that. Like, you don't go to work and then somebody else collects your paycheck. You don't go to work and then they tell you, oh, you're supposed to do this because of your love for us and out of the kindness of your heart and because you're a good Christian. You get a paycheck because you also need to feed a family. You also need to take care of your home. You also need to take care of all that stuff. So he's saying you can logically see that, but he says you don't have to just take me on my word at it. The law tells you this. The law tells you that when somebody works, they should eat. Even the ox, you're not allowed to muzzle his mouth when he treads the corn. And he says God didn't say that because he's so caught up in animal rights. He said it because he's trying to get it through our heads that somebody who works should get paid for the work that they do. It's normal that that happens. Now he's applying this, you have to understand, to their church and to the church at Corinth directly in this passage. And that's why it's important for us to understand this. It actually answers a lot of questions about missionaries and how or why they should be supported. But it's very specifically the phrasing that we stopped reading at when he says, if you have partaken from me in spiritual things, is it weird? Is it somehow bad that I partake from you in carnal things? And we know what he means. It's money, it's food, it's a place to live, it's provisions for his life that are not spiritual things. Yes, your prayers are great. Yes, your spiritual support is great, but your spiritual support does not feed my children. Your spiritual support does not keep my wife off of the street, sleeping in the trees like a vagabond or whatever. Your spiritual support is great. I need all of that, but it doesn't take care of my family. If I want my wife to have a house to sleep in tonight and my children to have food to eat and for all of us to have clothes and all this stuff, there has to be somebody footing the bill for that. And I'm working for you as a minister to you to give you the gospel. So sadly, I can't send a bill to JP's job tomorrow and tell them to pay me. They're not going to pay me for my work. I don't think any of the rest of your jobs will either. Maybe I can write to Mache and his boss will send me some money. But most of you, your bosses are not going to send me any money. They're not going to help me in any way because I'm not working for them. But apart from jokingly the few of you who work for yourselves, I can't write to your bosses and ask them to send me money and be okay. But what I can expect is that he that preaches the gospel then should also live of the gospel. That is my job, and it should be paid and rewarded and everything, just like everybody else's job gets paid and rewarded. That's the point he's making to the church at Corinth. And while it sounds completely disconnected, because we're talking about your pastor, what is a missionary if not a pastor? He is someone who is going to plant churches and start churches and pastor those people and train somebody to one day take over as a pastor. Yes, probably. He should be. I mean, he should be planning that even if he's going to be there the rest of his life, somebody has to take his place when he's gone. But the idea of a missionary is he is planting a church. And so if he's going to feed people spiritually and he's going to give spiritual service, somebody has to provide for that carnally. And even missionaries who are not church planners, like let's say Dr. Whitlow, for example, you may not be aware of this, the prisons don't give him any money for going there to preach the gospel to those people. Somebody else has to pay that bill. Somebody else has to keep his family off the street. Somebody else has to keep his family clothed and fed and all of that. Or he can quit preaching the gospel and he can go work a secular job. Because I'll be honest, like as a pastor, if I'm being honest with you, I would never want to go back to secular work because while you are far more stressful to me than any job I ever had was, I love you and I love doing this work and I very much want to continue to do it. It is my heart and it has been my desire for many years to do this kind of work. But if we're talking about financially, believe me, you could never afford to pay me what I could make if I go work with my hands. I may not be Mike who goes around telling everybody I have golden hands, but mine are at least copper. I don't know. No, I am very skilled in a lot of different jobs, and I have skills that if I were to go and say I'm going to quit pastoring and I'm just going to work secularly and support my family that way, we would be a lot better off financially. For one, I'd quit giving my life savings to the church every so many years, and for two, they could pay me more than you could ever pay me. Because I'm not trying to be arrogant when I say that, but I am. While I'd have to learn electrical law here, I am an electrician, I am a welder, I am a fabricator, I am a machinist. I almost have my engineering degree. I'm not far from being able to finish that. I have quite a few degrees, but the degree I put the most care into is the job that I care the most about, and that's my degree in theology. So that's the bigger one because that's the one I care the most about because that's what God called me to do. So don't get me wrong, I'm not sitting here complaining and want you to feel sorry for me because I could be making 100 euros an hour if I would just go work at a secular job. I don't want you to feel sorry for me for that because that's not something I see as a sacrifice. I don't see that as a sacrifice any more than any mother who says, I'm going to stay home and take care of my children should feel like, oh, I'm sacrificed, I'm suffering so much because I take care of my family. No, it's a calling that you've accepted in your life that is far greater than anything you could have done otherwise. And that's the thing, like, material blessings, sure, I could do better for myself than a church could afford to do for me, and that's normal. It's honestly, church shouldn't be asked to do but so much. But when it comes to the spiritual things and doing what God's called me to do and surrendering to a calling that's greater, this is it. This is raising my family, taking care of this church. I can't find anything better to do with my life, but somebody has to pay for it. It's not, you understand, like my family doesn't eat for free and all of that. Somebody has to take care of those things. And I'm using myself as an example, probably in a large part because both as a pastor and a missionary, you can see this from both sides, that our church isn't paying for it yet. Well, we agreed to give a small salary to me, but because you couldn't afford it, I didn't take it. The church is, I can still say, we'll finish out the 7.5 years of just about that the church has never paid me a salary of any kind, no money at all. I've given all my money to the church. Somewhere after that, maybe we'll finally be able to say that I took something. You can call me greedy at that point. That whole $750 a month is to feed my family and kids and all that stuff. You can call me greedy after that. Uh, I'm joking. The church, don't you dare think that I'm saying that as a negative thing when I say 750. I'm laughing because if you call me greedy over that, it'd be pretty crazy. But the church wanted to do more. The church wanted to do more than that. I'm the one who capped it off and said, no, you can't do more than that. You can't afford it. It doesn't make sense. But one day maybe I'll collect a salary and I'll have that. But I don't do that because church can't afford it yet. You had to put all your money into a building. But the point is, you have a church, because if you're understanding the principles I'm building here, if you were going to eat spiritually, somebody had to pay for that carnally. Somebody had to pay the debt. And you couldn't have done it. There was no church here to pay for that. When I left America and I came here, I had my wife, and she had a few members of her family and a few friends of her family who were willing to come and meet with us. And I'm going to tell you now that none of them were going to support me financially, except for maybe Joe. Joe would have paid for all my food. No, none of them would have been able, or most of them wouldn't have been willing, probably, to try to support my family financially to start a church in Ghent. So yes, I could have went and worked a secular job, and I could have done all of that. That's true. That is possible. But the question is that God's will for how a church should function? Is that God's will for how a church should be done? Is that how God has ordained it? Is that when you want to start a new church in a new city where there is no gospel preaching church, that a man has to abandon his home and country and leave everything behind, go there, get a job, first work a few years, establish himself, and then start a church, and then eventually you can have a church there? Or is it that churches support those men and get them out there and pay for it and support them as missionaries so that they can get there and start preaching the gospel now, and souls are not dying over the next 7 years waiting for me to get established? You understand? Like, you have a choice. Like, you can say, oh, he should go do this, but can you find biblically that is what God actually wants? Because Paul is the exception. Paul's point in this passage is that he is the exception. That what he does is not normal. It's not what God expects people to do. That he did it because of the burden he had to get out there and preach. But there's a lot of things in the way that Paul did the gospel, preaching the gospel and starting churches, that I'm not able to do what Paul did because I'm not Paul. I don't have the abilities. I don't have the wisdom, the intelligence. I don't have a lot of what Paul had. And so if you're asking me to be Paul, then you really need to be able to give a much higher budget to what you can afford for a pastor. Because I don't think you could afford Paul if you actually had to pay him. But the point is that Paul is getting us to understand, how did God ordain for churches to function? And if you understand that principle, then you can answer, is there a financial obligation for us to help other churches to exist? So we left off in verse 11. Verse 12 says, if others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the holy things, live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So God's ordination is that if somebody is going to preach the gospel, they should live of it. And his example, he says, it's not weird to you when the plumber asks you to pay him for his services. It's not weird when the restaurant asks you to pay for your meal. It's not weird when anybody else asks you to pay for it, because it's normal that you would do that. That's where we picked up at reading. And then his example is, he says, don't you realize that when people went to the temple, that the money that was being given to the temple, the food that was being left there, the tithes that were being put behind in grain and all this stuff, God didn't eat the grain himself. This stuff was being used to provide for and take care of the priests and the Levites, God's people who were serving him and representing him to the nation of Israel. God used it to take care of his men because God has ordained. So you're asking me, how does God choose to do ministry? God has ordained that those who preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So is it God's will that I come and get a job over here as a welder and spend about 7 years of my life, getting established and then eventually start a church? No. God's will, his ordination for my life and for any other preachers, is that if I'm going to give my life to preaching the gospel, I don't have to come here and get a second job and spend time establishing myself and getting financially secure so that I can start a church. It's that the people who are taking the profit of having a church, of being fed spiritually, pay for that. And as a missionary, I can't come here and come to an empty building and say, okay, everybody, it's time for your tithes. I need paycheck so I can feed my family. that has to be built up. That has to be established somehow. Like, you have a church that honestly is getting closer and closer to the day where you could afford a full salary for a pastor. You're getting there because you tithe quite well as a church compared to a lot of missionary churches I'm aware of. You do quite well with that. And this is why children shouldn't have cell phones in church. Or maybe that's an adult and I'm picking on the wrong person. I just saw a child holding it or reaching down there. But you do quite well as a church. You are working hard. You're building all these things. You don't have to pay for your building anymore. And one day you may reach there. But it's taken you 7.5 years to get to this point, and you're still saying that, the light's at the end of the tunnel. I can see the day where we can afford to pay a pastor's salary. If you had to have me start with a group of people who could pay a pastor's salary, you would never have a church here. You would never have a local church established in Ghent. Somebody who wasn't in Ghent, who wanted there to be a church in Ghent, had to say, it's okay, we'll take care of the bill for now. One day you'll be mature and you can take care of yourself and you're able to provide. But the same way you as a parent take care of your child until he reaches maturity or she reaches maturity and can take care of herself, somebody had to say, we'll do the same thing for this church. That we'll invest in you and we'll plant a church there and we'll help it get started so that one day you'll be able to take care of yourself, because God didn't ordain that the pastor comes here and gets a secular job and little by little he develops the ability to start a church and then one day you have a church. No, God ordained that if he's going to come here and start a church and he's going to preach the gospel, that he would live of the gospel. And since there's nobody here who can pay for it, somebody else has to pay for that. And that's where the idea of supporting missionaries and all comes from biblically. That's why it's so necessary, is because God has ordained it. And if you take all of that we just saw and see that God connects it by the language, that if you've partaken spiritually, you pay carnally. That's what he said concerning Corinth, supporting Jerusalem. And that's what he says about the local church supporting their pastor. You see that he then applies all of this right back to the idea of supporting a missionary, supporting a pastor somewhere else, of getting churches going somewhere else. Is he said the church at Corinth was in debt. They owed it to the church at Jerusalem to help keep their doors open, because they only had the gospel because they had sent a preacher out from Jerusalem first to go preach the gospel to them. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in that story because I've spent a lot of time here already. And honestly, this is like the first verse on my list. I've got a whole page of notes after this. But you understand that the way that the church at Corinth got started is very simple. Jerusalem got broken up by persecution. Men got saved as a result of that dispersion of the people from Jerusalem. That's why you have James writing to those Jews scattered abroad and Peter writing to the strangers, the people who got saved from that, who are scattered abroad as well. You have these men writing to these churches that are getting started because their church was destroyed and people were scattered for it. And so one of the churches established greatly through that was the church at Antioch. The church where Barnabas went to be their pastor, and he took Paul there, and the two of them trained up at that church as pastors until one day the Holy Spirit said, you're going to be the first two missionaries I send out to go give the gospel and start churches and other places officially like this. So he called them and set them out as missionaries and sent them out to go give the gospel in all these other places. And the only reason Corinth got a church started is because first Jerusalem sent out those preachers, because they sent Barnabas out like a missionary to Antioch. They sent him out to go get that church established and get it going. And when that church was strong enough, they sent Barnabas out to go start a church somewhere else. And he says, you want to talk about profiting from somebody else? You only have a pastor because Jerusalem trained him first. You only have a pastor because they supported him and paid for him first. You only have a pastor because Jerusalem took care of you and got you a pastor. And now Jerusalem is suffering and they can barely afford to keep the doors open anymore. Right now, they're going through such persecution and trial, they can barely keep going. And how selfish is it for you to say, well, they should take care of themselves when you couldn't take care of yourselves and they took care of you? That's the point he's making to them. You only have a church because somebody else said, I'll foot the bill, I'll take care of that. So how selfish is it to say, well, we have a church, they should pay for their church? So before you as a church could ever say that it's not my responsibility to support missionaries, somebody else can pay for that. Let the people in Italy pay for their church. Let the people in Germany pay for their church. Let the people in Moldova pay for their church. Before you could ever say that, you need to go back and pay back all the money that's been paid for you to have a church. You need to pay it back to the churches in the U.S. Because you talk about selfish. You've been eating from their hand for 7.5 years. More than that if you count the time it took me to raise money just to get here in the first place. You've ate from their hand for 7.5 years. Everything you have is the benefits of them supporting you. And now God's saying you have the ability. You're mature enough, you can help somebody else. And then say, well, they should pay for themselves. You didn't pay for yours. You didn't get here by yourself. What do you have that you have not received? And if you have received it, why do you act as if you have not? Everything you have in this church, yes, you gave some money for it, but think about the money we raised to pay for this building. 100,000 of it maybe could be attributed to our church and people connected to our church directly. No more than 150 maximum of 450. So if you want to pay back the other 300,000 to the churches that helped you and then say we're self-made and nobody helped us and we did it all by ourselves, you'd still be a liar, but at least you wouldn't be as hypocritical about it. Now, I'm not trying to be rude when I say it that way. I'm wanting you to take it to heart and understand what I'm saying to you. Is if you're asking, do you have a responsibility to support missionaries, then yes. Because I don't care where you're from, what church you got saved in. Every person in this room got saved in a church that got started because somebody went out of another church and started that church. Every church you've been to got started because somebody went out of another church and started that church. You have never been a self-made person. You got the gospel because somebody else paid for somebody else to give it to you. And God expects that cycle to continue. That is how God has ordained it. And if you want to see the proof that Paul didn't just support himself all the time, Paul did that because he was the first missionary and this system had not been fully established yet. The same way a lot of stuff was done in the Bible, but not the way that God kept doing it. It's just the way it got started. Is just look at Paul's life. Look at the church of Philippi, for example. Paul mentions, I'll mention Acts 20 as you're turning to Philippians 4. Philippians 4, but Paul mentions in Acts 20, he says, I worked with my own hands and I didn't take profit of anyone because I didn't want to preach the gospel of necessity. But in the same passage, he also says that people gave to him and supported him. Like he mentions, he's not saying that nobody supported him financially as a missionary. He's saying that nobody paid enough to actually feed him and take care of him. They helped him, but he didn't have enough support to pay all the bills. So he still had to go work and support him and the other people helping him. But it wasn't because that was the right thing to do. It's because churches weren't doing the right thing. It's because there wasn't enough people supporting Paul for him to not have to work anymore. And that's why he's making the argument to Corinth that he shouldn't have had to have worked. Peter and all the others don't have to. He should be able to focus entirely on the ministry. That it's a shame that he had to make tents and all this stuff. He was not ashamed to do it. He was happy to do it. But it was a shame on the churches that he had to do that. So then Philippians chapter 4. I just want to establish for you that Paul collected money from other churches as support. It wasn't a strange thing that happened. So and this is just a few passages. You can find more. Philippians 4 and verse number 10 says, But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. Notwithstanding, ye will do well, ye have well done, that ye did communicate with my afflictions. Now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica ye sent once and again unto my necessity, not because I desire to give, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. So this passage, which you've probably heard it preached every other way but this, is Paul telling to the church at Philippi that I am thankful for you because you gave to me and supported my ministry when nobody else was doing it yet. You were the first church to say, whatever Paul's doing, we want to invest in that and be a part of that. Whatever Paul's doing, we want to help him do it. And so he said, you sent money to me multiple times to help me. And he says, I'm not glad because I'm greedy and I just want your money. He said, I'm glad because you had the heart that you wanted to be invested in that ministry. And I'm glad because I also know that God's going to bless you for that. There'll be fruit to your account because you had a part in my ministry and helped me to get the gospel to these places. So Philippi, we know, in fact, that's not the only verse. You can actually go through Philippians several times. He mentions how that they supported him. And you have to know the language to understand what he means as a financial gift. He's talking about them supporting his needs. And I chose this passage because it's the one that's most clear about that. And then 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 7 through verse 9. It says, "Have I committed an offense in abasing myself, that ye might be exalted, because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely? I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which I was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so I will keep myself." Paul tells the church at Corinth, and if you pay attention to this passage and read it in its entirety, you'll find that Paul believes one of his greatest mistakes he made with Corinth was not letting them pay him a salary as a pastor, because they learned to be selfish, they learned to be greedy. And he says that concerning that church, he says, even now I'm not going to take your money. That's what he means when he says, I'll stay this way, I'll continue this way. He said, I'm still not going to take any money from you. But he says, I robbed other churches because I let other churches support me as a missionary and pay me to be your pastor when you didn't give me nothing. And he said, even when I was there and I was taking care of you and I was hungry and I didn't have money and I didn't have the basic needs that I had in front of me, it wasn't you that took care of me. It was the poor churches in Macedonia. It was the church of Galatia and other ones like them that sent money to support me when I was in need. It wasn't you. And I don't want to say this in any way mean. I don't want to hurt somebody with this, but I'll give you an example of what he means by that. While I've been here, I've had to buy 2 vehicles because I run my vehicles down, running people back and forth for the church. Even Sophania advised me the other day not to use my vehicle anymore to carry stuff for people because it's damaging the inside of it, and I need this for my family. And he's probably right, to be honest. It's hard for me to say no, but he's probably right. But I've had to buy 2 vehicles on the mission field, and other people paid for that, not this church. The reason I have a vehicle to get to the church to preach the gospel to you and run all the things and carry away, all the trash been carried away from this building was carried in my car. All the big furniture stuff had to be carried, it's carried in my car. Nobody else volunteered to come do that. Macha came with his trailer a time or two and he volunteered, but most all of it was carried away by me. All the chairs and stuff you had, most of this was carried in my car. And I'm not trying to be arrogant, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just giving you an example so you understand what he's talking about. Is he's looking at Corinth and saying, when I need it, in this case, I needed a car, it wasn't your church that paid for it. It was somebody else's church paid for that. I used it for you. I used it for your benefit, but it wasn't you that paid for it. And he's making a point very similar to that to them, saying that when I was there and I was hungry, you didn't feed me. It was somebody else's church that fed me. Somebody else's church paid for me to make sure that me and Barnabas had food to eat when we were there. And so he's making a point to them that he said, I robbed other churches, which means there are other churches who were paying the bill. And he says specifically the churches at Macedonia were the ones who helped him when he was there, which would imply beyond Macedonia, there was other churches. And since it's plural, it can't just be Philippi. Which what that is telling you is that a multitude of churches were supporting Paul. They maybe didn't support monthly the way you and I do, but they were giving to him and trying to help keep his ministry going because they were thankful for what Paul had done for them, and they wanted other people to have churches just like what Paul had done for them. So if you're asking me if you're indebted, then yes, because God has ordained that that's how mission should be. God has ordained that that's how it should work. And actually one of the most interesting things to me about the church at Corinth is if you go back to 1 Corinthians 16, you'll find that Paul calls out 3 men. One of them, Stephanas, I don't remember the other 2, but he calls out 3 men by name, and he says, I'm thankful that when you didn't give to me, when you didn't help with the needs that I had, those 3 men come and took care of me. They had to go around you to support the missionary because your church didn't even want to do it. But they came and helped me when I was in need. You think about that. That's a shameful thing that this man who started their church, this man who's been left them to go start churches somewhere else, their church refused to help him financially. So he said some of the men in your church who had the right heart, they had to go around the leadership and come do it themselves and give directly to me because your church wouldn't do it. So it's a shame on a church is what I'm trying to say. When we are happy to take all the benefits, to receive everything that everybody else is giving. We're happy to eat from everybody else's hand, but we're not willing to give and support missionaries. It is a shameful thing. And God is using that to teach us that we do have a debt. If you have a church, then you have a debt to help make sure that the gospel goes further and it doesn't stop with you. You understand, the problem you have with any form of socialism or any of this kind of stuff, wherein one person is giving to help the next, is that always somewhere in that line there's somebody who says, oh, if you're going to give to me, why should I work anymore? And so the blessings stop at some point because one person starts to get greedy and collect them. And that's why you get tired of giving your check to the government and letting them give it to people. Because if they were giving it to people who genuinely could not work and were genuinely in need, you'd be happy for that. You don't mind helping that. Nobody in this room minds giving money to help somebody who's truly disabled, somebody who truly is down on their luck, truly in need of help. Nobody is offended by that. What you're offended by is the fact, and naturally so, that there's people who they take money from your paycheck and give it to them, who sit at home and watch TV, who are perfectly healthy and perfectly able to go out and work a job, but they found out that the blessings trickle down and they don't have to go no further. They can take the money from you and from the government and sit home happy and never have to do anything. They don't have to be a part of the system and part of society. And when your church doesn't support missions, that's what you are. You're the freeloader who eats off the government and these things, who doesn't want to contribute to the system. And again, I'm not talking about somebody who you've paid your money in. If you're retired or any of that kind of stuff, I'm not talking about you. Don't get offended. I'm talking about those people who, you know who I'm talking about, 20 years old, perfectly healthy, but they went to the doctor and claimed that they're mentally incompetent to work, but they're fine to do everything else. They're fine to ride scooters and cars and everything else down the road. They may not be very good at it, because they almost run you over on a regular basis. But they do all this stuff, and they work in the black, no problem either. They have no problem working when it's not paid in taxes to the government. But they're happy to stay home and collect the money. We as a society, we have a word for it. It's called a freeloader. And I'm sorry if that offends any of you, but biblically, God says people should work, so it shouldn't offend you. If your church is the church that doesn't support missionaries, that's what you are to the cause of Christ. You're the one who takes and takes and takes, but you never give. You never contribute back. And so God says the system He's ordained is that those who partake of the gospel pay for it. And when you've got to the place where you can help somebody else to get the gospel who can't afford to pay for it yet, God says it's your debt to do that. Because we're debtors to all men. Remember, we saw that in Romans chapter 1. He says we are debtors to all men. Let's read that. I can stop with that. I don't have to keep going. I wanted to get into the Great Commission, but we're going to spend all next month talking about that, so we don't have to get into that today. But Romans chapter 1 and verse number, I don't even see where we're at, verse number 14. I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. Talking about giving the gospel, Paul says, I am a debtor to everyone, whether they're educated, uneducated, whether they're the Greek, whether, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you come from, what your level of education, who you are as a person. I owe it to you that you get the gospel. He says that's why I preach the gospel of Christ, if you read it in the context. The reason we give the gospel and we pay for somebody else is because you can't go everywhere to give the gospel. You can't just pack up your family and go tomorrow and go start a church somewhere. Many of you are not qualified to be pastors for the reason that God calls men to preach. Many of you are not qualified to be pastors in the grounds that God has never called you to preach. I mean, you understand, most of you can give the gospel, you can be an evangelist, you can be a soul winner, but you can't go open a church. There is a way that God has ordained for that to be done too. And you can't go around God's back and go do whatever you want to and start a church and be, okay, this is my way of fulfilling the Great Commission and doing what God wants. No, God has ordained that men first study, they prepare, you lay no hands on man suddenly, but when a man's proven himself and God calls him to the mission field, somebody has to pay for it. And if you're asking the people in a far distant land who've never heard the gospel to pay for it, that's never going to happen. It's the people who have the gospel who have to contribute to the system to keep the gospel going. That's who's supposed to be paying for it. And so that's what God expects of our church. It is our responsibility. Because God has given, I'll say this much of the Great Commission, God has given the commandment to go ye into all nations, teaching and baptizing in His name. Starting churches is what He's talking about. Getting people saved and starting churches. He tells you to go first to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth and preach the gospel to every creature. How are you going to do that? You personally, if you think this is your individual commandment, how are you going to do that? You struggle to preach the gospel to everybody on your street. You're going to go preach it to everyone in Hong Kong? You're going to go preach it to everyone in Canada, the U.S., wherever you pick a country. I don't care. You're going to preach it to everyone in the next city? You understand, like, some of this is a tangible goal for you. It's very tangible for us to believe as a church we can get the gospel to the entire city of Ghent. We just need to be more faithful. It's very tangible to believe we can get the gospel to most of Belgium. We just need to be more faithful. Maybe we can forget Wallonia. It's a different language. We can just focus on Flanders. But we can get the gospel to at least our part of the country. We let the other churches in the south do the other half. No, I'm joking. You understand this. But it is very feasible that this church could reach this half of the country with the gospel. Honestly, it's not impossible for us to reach the country if we were just more faithful. But I don't care how faithful you are. You're not going to reach every country and every people and every language and every tribe and all this kind of stuff. You're not going to do it. It's not possible for you individually. Somebody has to go. And if somebody's going to be sent, they're going to go give the gospel, somebody has to pay for it. And just like somebody paid for you to get it in the first place, it's expected that you don't just sit down and say, okay, I've got all my benefits, I can relax, the government's going to take care of me. You're supposed to, at some point, start taking care of yourself, get on your feet and be a grown, mature person, and contribute and help somebody else have the gospel. And I'll tell you, maybe I've got it backwards as a church because I'm asking you to contribute before you're taking care of yourself. Because you don't support your pastor. You don't finance your own bills to have a church. But I'm maybe putting the cart in front of the horse, so to speak. But I think it's important. I'm not going to wait till the day we can afford to finance a pastor's salary. It's important that we go ahead and do our part to make sure somebody else has a church and other people are hearing the gospel, and the gospel is continuing to spread way beyond our personal reach as a church. That's what I think we need to be focused on right now and trying to do. And so that's why we're entering into this part. Again, I have so much. That's nothing in my notes what we've talked about, but it's the stuff that we needed to hear. He talks about it being fruitful, all of that. We talked about that this morning, so hopefully you got enough from that. But he does make it clear that it's your responsibility. If you want fruit, that you have to sow something. You have to do something. You have to be contributing and giving in some way. Father, we thank you and praise you, God, for all that you do. Thank you for your blessings. We ask you to watch over us, help us to serve you. Thank you, Lord, for all this. Pray that you just help in all that's been said and done here today. Use it, Lord, to bring glory to your Son. We ask it in Jesus' name.